we are joined now by John Washington, staff writer at Arizona Luminaria, contributor for The Intercept, journalist, author of The Case for Open Borders. You can also find him on Substack at Lit and Border News. John, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So, I love a good deliberately provocative title. It's right up my alley here because we keep hearing about this crisis on the border, and we just opened the show talking about the what's in the budget agreement, and there are a lot of right-wing concessions for border militancy, increased funding for border patrol agents, the ability to hire more border patrol agents. And it appears that a majority of members of Congress, including the Democratic president himself, have conceded basically the entire point to the right on how there's a crisis at the border. I mean, what's your reaction to this current political moment and how there is this seemingly bipartisan consensus in D.C. about the border being this massive problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think just watching it, it seems like they have acquiesced or conceded to so much. I'm talking about the left or the Democratic left, that their strategy at this point, I struggle to find a better way to describe it than just lying down and playing dead. Like, what are they standing for? I don't really know. What's I think particularly frustrating about this is that they've tried this tactic before, and it didn't work before, and it's not working now. I mean, we saw in 2013, the Democrats try to concede as much as possible. This is during the Obama administration, to the right, supposedly to gain political capital so they could pass a major reform bill, and it didn't happen. We saw it again early this year. This long debated, bipartisan or tripartisan, if you count Kristen Sinema from Arizona, where I am, Senate bill, and they gave away, basically they just forgot about their principles and gave away all this to the right, and it didn't pass. And all of a sudden, like a month later, during the State of the Union, Biden was trying to play the same move again. It's like, wait, why are you not learning at this point?
Yeah, for like this potential hypothetical electoral victory to show that the Republicans are unreasonable, as if that has ever worked. And we've done this many, many times before in different contexts, just not on the border really as much as this current moment.
Yeah, and another thing here that I think is worth pointing out is that despite all these concessions that you're rightly pointing out, they're also playing this other role in which they seem to be, or they're at least rhetorically taking the stance that they are working against the most upsetting or most anti-immigrant policies coming out of, for example, Texas. And I think that is a bad framing. They are not on opposite sides of this issue. They are, I think Texas is picking a fight with them, and they're standing up, but really only in a rhetorical way. They're really only posturing. And, even we saw them condemn, and they are trying to defend in court their ability to enforce immigration policies. But really, when it comes down to it, the policies aren't that dissimilar. These are policies that we have seen the federal government, even the Biden administration, really embrace in their very recent past. And now they're pitting themselves politically as if they're against Texas. And it's just these are not people on two sides of the issue. These are people very much on one extreme side of the issue that are having their little quibbles on that very edge of the conversation. Even Mexico, the Mexican government came out with a statement against when for a brief moment yesterday, or was this 2 days ago now, the Texas law was able to be enforced. The Mexican government said, this is anti-Christian. This is something that is against our principles. It's like, wait a minute, you have been doing the dirty work of the United States immigration enforcement regime for years. You've been ramping up that dirty work, and all of a sudden this Texas law takes effect and you're taking a stance on it. It's really, you're seeing politicians speak out of both sides of the mouth at the same time and really not take an actual stand on principle, which is one of the major points of the book. It's where are we? What do we stand for?
No. There's so much great stuff in your book and so much excellent context, but I have to ask you to expand on that point about Mexico because I headlined AMLO's statements there, the kind of criticism of Texas's law, but you seem to be kind of hinting at the fact that there's some hollowness there. What is the context of Mexico's role in maintaining United States border militancy?
Oh, this is something we have seen being ramped up for a long time. And, you know, similar to this idea of like taking a posture against some of this more draconian enforcement, these more draconian enforcement measures, they really are also implementing them. So they can posture against them, but they are implementing them. And I'll talk about how is that the Mexican government has been engaged in more deportations than we've seen in many years. They are implementing more enforcement zones along their southern border. They are denying asylum claims at a very high rate. They've also seen more asylum claims than they've seen in history in this past couple of years. And then the creation of this rebranded military outfit, the National Guard, which was something that AMLO did soon after taking office. This was one of his major, supposedly, security reform projects. And yet, really, they're just giving the same people different uniforms. And there was some ousting of some of the chopping off heads of some of the top officials. But really, we're seeing much of the same things. And we're seeing just absolutely brutal the detainment of migrants by law enforcement officials in Mexico, both local and these National Guard officials. We're seeing kidnappings. We're seeing them colluding with some of the human smuggling gangs. And this is just a continuation of much of what we've decried, and even the Mexican government has decried for a long time, but it's just still happening, just being talked about in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of maintenance and expansion without much opposition, and an alternative vision for what this could look like, which is what your book provides. So I guess let's dive into that here. This concept of borders and how it's amazing to me. You know, of course, we're constantly thinking about like Israel right now and Gaza, and just how people can so quickly treat these political structures that we've decided on as something that just came out of nature. I mean, Biden's older than the state of Israel, but we have to talk about Israel as this incredibly important thing to maintain. ICE was created after 9/11, and AOC is apparently radical for when she ran on abolishing ICE, right? And a lot of members of the squad. But that's not radical because we're just looking back a few decades at this point. And what your book talks about is how border walls and these detention centers and closed borders in this way are a relatively new phenomenon. Can you talk about the history of militarized borders and how it rapidly has kind of escalated over the past 6 or 7 decades?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways you can look at this. In the year 2000, shortly before 9/11, there were about 15 militarized border walls throughout the world. Today, there's just under 80. So we have seen an incredible explosion of border enforcement throughout the world. And that number is still rising. There's more being planned. You mentioned ICE. ICE has only been around since 2003. For 95% of our country's history, we had no ICE. And, you know, there's a lot of people who say things like, without a border, you can't have a country, or without this sort of intense enforcement regime, we wouldn't be able to maintain the status quo of the country. But this is all very new. We had effectively no real border infrastructure like walls or fences before the 1990s. There was some that started in the 80s, but really what we see today is over 700 miles of wall, about 20,000, a little under 20,000 border patrol officials. None of that was around that. I mean, it was like incomparable. And yet, you know, things seemed, were far from perfect, and there's plenty of suffering along the border, and there's a lot of people who had more difficulties crossing than others, and sometimes it was really bad, but nothing like what we're seeing today. In fact, for the first 100+ years of our country's history, there was zero federal immigration laws on the books, zero. So it's possible. Abolish ICE is something that we don't have to go that far back in our history to see that we could exist without it. And yet, I think that people sort of fall into this trap of the status quo, or the status quo bias, where exactly as you're saying, like all of a sudden it seems unimaginable or like anathema to what a country is to see beyond these walls. But we also have lots of examples throughout the world of places where there are no walls, or where there is effectively open immigration. Of course, the EU is probably the first thing that comes to mind. And there's a lot of fears, especially in Western Europe, about what would happen if they opened up this passport-free zone. And none of those fears were realized. My own family comes from Romania, from Eastern Europe. That was one of the later countries that was tacked onto this free passport zone. A lot of people were like, all the Romanians are going to come to Spain or France, and we're really nervous about it. And yet that didn't happen. Actually, a lot of the migration from Eastern Europe to Western Europe stayed the same, or even slowed down to some degree. So there's I think a lot of fear that is not really warranted about what could happen or what things could look like. There's also all of this seemingly amnesia of what things looked like before. And there's another, I think, really important thing here is when people advocate for walls, at least the status quo, or maybe even more walls, or more miles of walls, or higher walls, or whatever, blacker walls, like Trump wants to paint them black, or dig moats around the country as well. One thing that is often left out of the conversation is how ineffective they are. They really don't work very well, or they don't work to do what they're purported to do. People have always migrated. They're migrating now, and they will migrate in the future. I think the real question is not how to stop them, because we can't, and we can get into that a little bit, but how do we respond to people moving? And I think if you sort of just change the framing on that question a little bit, I think it brings up a little bit more of understanding and the humanity that's involved in the issue. It's like, okay, it's inevitable that people are going to come. So do we want to give them the boot, or make their lives miserable, or break apart their families and try to excommunicate them? Or can we say, we can't stop them, so maybe we can make it better for all of us? And there's a lot that we could talk about there too, about how migration is a huge boon for all.
For all, yes. And the fact that we can't stop them is in part due to the fact that there has been an escalation in displacement, in part due to, I want to get to the United States in a second, and we can talk about how U.S. policy in Latin and South America results in the displacement, but you mentioned Europe there. And it is notable, because within the EU, right, there's very free movement country to country, and you can go for a weekend to another country by train. But for some of these countries that now have far-right governments, I mean, Giorgia Meloni comes to mind in Italy, they are obsessed with preventing certain kinds of people from entering the country. Migrants, coming across the sea, Meloni has been defunding these kind of NGO organizations that are responsible for rescuing them, to just force them to drown. So can you talk about that very obvious incongruence where, hey, other people who kind of look like us from other European countries can freely come and visit, but if we're having migration from African countries or Middle Eastern countries, time for them to drown in the ocean? Right.
Yeah, it's worse than incongruence. You're right. It is also that, but it's blatant hypocrisy and racism.
Yes.
Take Italy as an example, and it's a really telling example. For well over a century, Italy was a country of huge emigration. Many, many Italians left, primarily to the United States. Look at Germany as well. Germany, especially in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, was a place that was sending a lot of people to different countries. Again, mostly the United States, but many other places as well. And a lot of them were not met with open arms. They were reviled. They were, slurred. They were, slurs were cast on them. They were trying to push back, and yet Italians, they were, crying foul about their treatment, and yet they didn't stop leaving because of poverty, because of war, because of all sorts of things. And now the tables have turned a little bit. Southern Europe has become a place not of emigration as much as immigration, though many Italians, people born in Italy, are still living outside of the country. Same with Germans. There's, many millions of German people who were born in Germany are living outside the country. So that doesn't seem to be a problem for them. And yet when people come to the country, all of a
they're
sudden...
expats. They're expats as opposed to illegals. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think also one thing that is typically misrepresented, there's a lot of conversation right now about asylum in Europe, and it is giving rise to the far right because these fears are stoked. But the solution is pretty obvious at the same time. And, we've seen it actually in effect because people have been coming to Southern Europe increasingly for the last 10 years. And it's not a problem. Actually, when you look at it, it's like there are jobs that are being filled that were not filled earlier. People are assimilating. Crime hasn't gone up despite, people making a lot of hay out of a couple individual crimes. In gross numbers, crimes have not gone up. And so, we don't have to look far for an example of it working. It's already working, actually. Immigrants are boosting the Italian economy. So, we don't need to imagine some future way that we can actually help people settle in. They are already settling in. Of course, they would settle in probably a lot more smoothly. And here we could maybe transition to places like New York or Chicago if they were not scapegoated, marginalized, if they were given work permits more quickly. And even when they're not, they figure things out and things are kind of pretty fine. Actually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've talked on this program about how, in fact, increasing the precarity of the living situations for people who are here in an undocumented status gives employers more leverage over those workers, because if they step out of line, there's a threat, and they can also they're also forced to accept lower wages. So can you speak about how border closure and militancy is a way to kind of build exploitative machinery to a degree?
Right. I think the best way to think of it is the border acts as sort of like a fiscal fulcrum. It is the sort of centerpiece by which corporations can exploit differentials in wages, in worker protections, in unionization rates. And I'm currently in Arizona, I go down to northern Mexico pretty frequently for reporting and for, whatever, because I can cross the border at ease. And there are a lot of factories that are effectively modern day sweatshops. They're called maquiladoras, or maquilas for short. And the only reason that they exist is because of the border and the way that the border is able to keep or lock a certain number of people in place in northern Mexico and use their labor to produce stuff that we want to buy or that we want to sell in the United States. And, we saw the rise of this in, probably listeners are already sort of connecting the dots to NAFTA. This is when we really saw the border exploited in this way, when we decided to open up for free trade, most of North America, and yet further lockdown, because what happened in lockstep with the opening of NAFTA was further border militarization. I mean, at the exact same time, Congress was passing laws and starting to build what we now see as the incipient wall infrastructure that we're seeing along the border. So if people were able to move freely, if people were able to go where they were able to make higher wages, we wouldn't be able to exploit them. And Justin Akers-Chacon, who does great work on all this issue, he has a recent good book called The Border Crossed Us. He actually counted the number of free trade agreements that have any provisions for the free movement of labor. So right now, there's about 400 free trade agreements throughout the world. That's tracked by the World Trade Organization, and only 40 of those, as of a couple of years ago, had any provisions for the free movement of labor, and those were for only highly specialized fields. So what it comes down to is that the stuff that we buy and the money that is used to buy it has far more rights than a lot of the people that used to make it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think like when you look at just actually what's happening along the northern border, the northern Mexican borders, like shouldn't people have the same rights as your toaster oven, as your television that they're building, that can go back and forth and actually sometimes do multiple times in their production, and that people can't? It seems like obviously not only fundamentally unfair, but fundamentally exploitative.
Well, absolutely. And you can also draw a line as well to the decline in union density in the United States to this push for free trade, which is what these borders enable. And just the fact that the TPP, which was widely criticized, obviously, and Obama ended up having to walk away from it, and Hillary Clinton as a candidate too, was the fact that it created these essentially outside tribunals where if a government was going to create a regulation that would impose corporate profits, their corporations had the ability to go kind of over that and have a tribunal to determine whether or not this was a regulation that made sense. So it's not just that our free trade deals put our workers at such a lower class too, but it also elevated corporations over the power of states. At least in theory, it didn't end up happening. But I always am in awe of the fact that was a almost happened, honestly.
Well, I mean, it is also happening. I mean, there's a dispute settlement court where parties, including corporations, can bring countries to suit if they don't let them basically implement or let them have free reign and do what they will. There's a recent article about this in the Intercept, that a bunch of like the Bitcoin bros are taking Honduras to court because they're not allowed to operate there.
Yeah, we interviewed someone on that, right?
Yeah. One other point to make here is, I grew up in sort of like suburban Ohio, and a lot of the factories where like my friends' dads worked or like my uncles worked are now closed, and those closures followed on the heels of NAFTA, and a lot of those jobs went to northern Mexico. And there's one place in particular that just like is, I think, such an affront to those people. Is there's a former the place of a former huge steel factory outside of Cleveland that has been rebranded the Steel Yard, and there's like a giant Target and like Ross shoes and like all these things selling stuff that is made outside of the United States, where workers in the United States used to actually make this stuff. So like a lot of the people complaining about the border and supposed invasion or whatever, and the people coming to take jobs, those people lost their jobs because of bordering, actually. Bordering is not good for jobs actually anywhere, but particularly in places where there's been decently paid manufacturing jobs.
So let's just, as we kind of wrap up here, talk about what an alternative vision really is. I mean, you touched on it, but how our Border Patrol agents really, a lot of what they're doing is processing people, right? I mean, they're responsible for turning them away, which is a violation of international law and asylum protections, but they're turning people away, but they're dealing with, like, in the same way when you're going through an airport and you're dealing with somebody, if you're flying internationally, it's kind of like that, right? The fact that the Democrats right now aren't putting forward some sort of updated processing system for people so they can go through kind of a system of going to a court and saying, this is my case, and this is why I would like to live here. I mean, I would hope to move beyond that, but that also just seems like a clearly common sense way to deal with this, to modernize our processing. But instead, both parties seem to be moving towards more guns for the people doing the initial processing at the border. Just speak a bit about that insanity.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, the majority of Border Patrol work right now is saying hi to families, basically, or saying hi to people who have crossed and who are very willingly and like sometimes desperately wanting to turn themselves over into their custody. Um, and Border Patrol has recognized this, and they actually started hiring non-law enforcement trained officers to help with some of this processing. But the numbers just of people coming are higher than the current capacity is able to deal with. The solutions that have been proffered so far, as you say, are not going to help. It would be more wall, more surveillance technology, and they have plenty of that already. And it, is in many ways as ineffective as actual like steel infrastructure. And then the other recent proposal that has been championed by Biden, who promised during the campaign, even in the early days of his administration, to restore asylum, has been the other proper solution would be to incredibly increase the threshold for gaining asylum. So in numbers, when you look at it, actually, and so it's kind of funny that they break this down by numbers, but this is what they've had to do. Currently, you have to prove that you have about a 10% or higher chance of being persecuted or killed or tortured when you go back to your home country. They want to raise that to 50%. That's a really big change. And that also flies in the face of international and obviously current US law, which is what they're proposing to change. But what that would do is just imperil tens of thousands, rather hundreds of thousands of people, because it's already very hard to get asylum in the United States. The rates have fluctuated more, like a little bit over the past years, but really they've held steady, and most of the people are turned away, especially people from countries that we're friendly with. Like the asylum grant rate for people from Mexico right now is still under 10%. Most of the people cannot get asylum. And what we have in place here, this is something I think is also frequently overlooked. We have current policies on the books. They're not laws, they couldn't pass anything, that deny asylum to people who present outside of ports of entry, these people who are turning themselves into Border Patrol. So they're not eligible for asylum. Their first court dates is usually a couple years down the road. They're eligible for a couple protection statuses that are less protective than asylum, and they're withholding of removal or CAT. Sort of technical terms, but a really key point here is that this makes those forms of protection do not lead to any path to citizenship. There's no way that these people who are coming now, who are seeking asylum, but are going to be denied it because of these new procedures, are going to be permanent residents of the United States. So we're literally creating a two-tier system right now. These people cannot finally regularize, which is like the term of art, and become citizens. They're going to be stuck in this sort of half membership zone forever. It's like, again, like, who wants to live in a society where there's literally tiers of residents again? And yet this is what these policies are creating, and the proposal would even enhance that. So it's just like, I think we have it turned around completely backwards. Last point I say, because I know I'm sort of like throwing out a bunch of terms here, it's like, it seems complicated, and the way that we currently have it structured, it is complicated. I mean, asylum law, immigration law, there's thousands and thousands of pages that are currently on the books. But when you really think about it, and this is another sort of point I want to make in the book, and you step back a little bit, it's actually not that complicated. I think all of that legalese is really serves sort of as a smokescreen to defend this multi-agency, extremely expensive effort to keep people out. But really, like, people, find a way to come. If we let them, they'll have equal rights, and they'll work, and they'll be fine. And like, I think it's kind of actually simple, but we've like bent over backwards to make it difficult to try to keep people out, and we're failing at it.
Well, the book is excellent, and I really encourage people to check it out. It's called The Case for Open Borders. John Washington, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Emma.